Hi everyone, welcome to Module 12. This module will focus on evaluating student learning. I'd also like to start by just saying thank you for your service to those of you who are veterans. I know we have at least one person in our class who is a veteran of the U.S. military, so thank you so much for your service to our country. Um, so for this week, our mini lecture goals are to review strategies for independent learning, to talk briefly about evaluating student learning. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this module. I hope you find that the textbook is supplementary and that it provides you some more supports related to evaluation. Um, and then we'll have a quick wrap up. So, just as a review from our last module, we really focused on ways for pre service, or sorry, not pre service, but ways for general education teachers to support students in independent learning. And one of the primary ways that you can do that is simply by building agency in your students. So, helping students to find ways to engage in self determination by making decisions that lead to their desired outcomes and goals to help them become more self aware. And that can really be a really positive, really helpful strategy, especially for those students who struggle with executive functioning. So that might be students with ADHD, students with autism, even students with behavioral disorders or other cognitive needs, students who have experienced traumatic brain injuries. Many students in those categories can benefit quite greatly from the use of executive functioning strategies. So, helping them to build that self awareness can lead to strengthened agency among your students. And then finally, self advocacy. Helping students learn more about how to advocate more effectively for their needs is critical. And so these are all strategies and examples of ways that you, as general education teachers, can support not only your students with disabilities, but also those without. And it's a critical skill, especially for their development, for those of you who will be teaching middle grades or even high school students, as they transition into high school or into college. It's definitely something that is important um, for them. You will notice for students who transition into middle school, not quite so much, but especially for those of you who may teach secondary students in high school settings, that they are quite students who have IEPs. Some of them are quite knowledgeable about the goals that are on their IEP. Some of them have or will be participating in their IEP meetings, and sometimes they will know more about their goals than you. So I encourage you to actually engage in conversations with your students and their parents who are more sort of self advocates and who are quite self-determined in their in achieving their goals, specifically the goals that are written into their IEPs, because you can learn a lot from your students about how to support them. And I think that's a really great example of how teachers can best partner with students to achieve goals that not only you have for them, but also to help them achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. So, in terms of setting goals and achieving goals, this week we want to talk briefly about ways to evaluate student learning. So, just take a minute and kind of think about what are some of the things that you evaluate in the classroom, and then what do you learn from that evaluation, right? So, one of the things that we think about are classroom performance, and we have a couple different ways that we typically measure or evaluate that classroom performance, be it through formative evaluation. So, sort of more continuous evaluation as you go along, and then summative evaluation at the conclusion of a unit or a particular lesson, right? So we might be thinking about more comprehensive sorts of evaluations. We also have benchmark exams and end of grade exams that are used as standards of performance evaluation. So we have a few different ways that we evaluate student learning. There are a number of testing accommodations that are allowed on most standardized tests, and the big five are noted here. So, read aloud is one accommodation that is allowed on standardized tests. Students who have this written into their IEP can also have extra time. Many students who struggle with sort of focusing and need to have separate space could also have this accommodation that they be in a separate room for their exams. Some students might be allowed to take it in multiple sessions instead of one um, sort of big chunk of time. Many students who have disabilities or have an IEP might have the accommodation that includes the ability to mark in their book. So those are kind of the five primary ones that you might see that you should be familiar with and prepared for, especially for students who have IEPs who might be in your classrooms, because this may be different than what you are used to for students who do not have disabilities. And then another thing related to the accommodations is that the students who receive these accommodations on their testing, like during these evaluations, they must be also receiving these accommodations during their everyday schooling. So you can't receive these accommodations on an evaluation, like on an end of grade test, if they haven't already been receiving them for at least 30 days in their settings. Um, so that's something that's really critical. So if it's something that if you notice that a student really needs some supports, you should go ahead and speak to their case manager or reach out to the special education teacher or to your administrator and say, hey, I think Thomas really seems to be needing more time to complete these math problems, right? It's not that he can't complete them, but he just needs more time. And that has implications for the way that your students will be evaluated. It also has implications for the way we evaluate students, right? So let's say you notice that, but you don't speak up about it. Then Thomas takes the EOGs or end of course exam, and he doesn't do so well because he ran out of time. Is that a measure of his knowledge or a measure of his disability, right? That would technically be more of a measure of the kind of the context of his disability, because perhaps he needs more time for processing. And in fact, he can do the math. He can do the math, but he just didn't have enough time. So in essence, I'm not going to say play the guilt game or anything and say that's your fault, but I want you to recognize where you can step in as an advocate for your students. And when you notice these things, being able to say, hey, I think having this accommodation for Thomas could be much more beneficial for him, not only for my formative and summative evaluations in the class, but also for his benchmark exams or end of course exams that have really strong implications both for his performance but also for your own evaluation as a teacher. So definitely keep those things in mind. Are accommodations necessary? You really want to determine the extent to which the accommodations are necessary, but also the extent to which they are beneficial. Sometimes we implement things that we think students need and maybe they don't actually need them, or maybe they're counterproductive. We never want to go on assuming that all accommodations are going to be necessarily effective. So you want to keep an eye on how useful they are, if they are useful, and you want to collect data on that efficacy. So I want to give you a quick example of a little scenario that I've been experiencing here in the area. So we'll call this student, obviously this is not a real picture of the student, we'll call him Michael. So Michael is a sixth grader at a local school, and he has been diagnosed with autism. He recently transitioned into this new school when he went to sixth grade. And, you know, when he got there, the teachers, the administrators, the case managers somehow misplaced or never apparently received his IEP from his elementary school. So that was kind of the first issue. His placement was in the general education setting, but he was supposed to be receiving special education services to support his needs related to his autism. So in the first couple weeks, Michael wasn't receiving any of the special education modifications or accommodations that were written into his IEP because the school didn't even have his IEP. So that's already an issue. And then when the parents went to the IEP meeting, the school, the teachers, the administrators, the case manager, no one was really able to speak to the data that they had about the effectiveness of Michael's accommodations and modifications because there was no data, right? Like It's a number of issues. I don't want to, give too many details about this situation, but the reason I wanted to bring it up was because in order to determine if accommodations are beneficial or modifications are beneficial, you have to be collecting data. So most recently, some of the administrator or case manager, I'm not sure exactly who it was, reached out to mom and said, "We think Michael needs to be reevaluated, and we're also considering putting him in another placement, or we want to consider some other options." And my reading of that, considering other options, usually means that um, the team wants to put the student in a self contained classroom, that they feel like they aren't able to give him enough support in his current setting. And for him, the current setting is primarily general education, but he receives like 30 minutes of reading and resource and 30 minutes of math in a resource setting, which means he's pulled out to get more specific supports and special education services in those settings. So, this is not only frustrating and overwhelming for his parents, but also frustrating and overwhelming for the team because they feel like they aren't necessarily able to reach Michael. But the problem is that they also aren't measuring how they're trying to reach him and looking at those outcomes. It's impossible to say that modifications aren't working when they've only been in place for 2 weeks. You need more time than that to really measure them. You also have to make sure that the entire team is engaging in the use of those modifications in the same way. So we call that fidelity of implementation. If one of you is implementing one strategy one way and the other person is supposed to be implementing the same strategy in the same way, but it's quite different, there is low fidelity of implementation. So that creates issues related to how we measure outcomes. So, my big point here is yes, modifications are useful and can be useful, and if written on the IEP, are required, but you need to actually implement them before you can go say, oh, this isn't helpful, or even that this is helpful. You need data to be able to back that up. So, I just wanted to use that as a little case study to share with you about the importance of collecting data, the importance of actually providing the modifications and accommodations that are written into IEPs. Those are federally mandated, IEPs are federally mandated contracts, if you will. And so for a school or a teacher or case manager or whomever, a related service provider, to not be following the mandates that are written within the IEP, the accommodations that are written there, that is technically in violation of a federally binding document. And so you want to be really careful with that and really careful with the way you talk to parents and kind of share those things with them because it's obviously a sensitive topic and perhaps he does need to be in a new placement. And if the data show that, then that's fine. But you can't go say, you know what, we think your son needs to be in a new placement. However, we have no data to support that. Like, I think sometimes when we hear these stories, you guys are probably like, what? That doesn't make sense. Why would they suggest that without having anything to support it? But it really does happen in many situations. And so I wanted to use this as just a quick story to help you all think more about the importance of collecting data and the importance of actually following the IEPs. It's okay if you don't understand everything that is on the IEP. You can ask to speak to an administrator who could walk you through it. You can ask to speak to a special education teacher or case manager. Oftentimes, there will be school psychologists at your school who could help support you in that. I mean, you could even reach back out to one of your professors from college. Let's say you get out into the classroom next year and you have a student who's in your classroom who has an IEP and you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? You can always email me. Like, this is what we're here for. I would rather you reach back out to me and say, hey, Dr. P, this is new. I know we talked about this in class, but I'm still nervous. What do I do? Like, that is fine to be able to acknowledge that maybe this is an area where you need to learn a little bit more and find some supports. That is perfectly okay, but you do not want to go ignoring a modification or accommodation that should be in place for your student because you're not sure how to implement it. That is in direct violation of a federally binding contract, and you don't want to get into a situation where you're in due process and et cetera, et cetera. It can be very ugly when people aren't following these IEPs as they are written. So, anyways, that was a long scenario, but I hope that you find that example helpful in thinking about how to support your students in the classroom. So some other accommodations include modified assignments. So for example, this might be that a student does, half of a worksheet instead of the entire thing. It might be that they have some sentence frames that are provided when they do a summary of a story. It could include alternate assignments. So basically what you're saying here is you need to find out what the student already knows and how they can show their mastery of content in a way that they can be successful. And this might look different for different learners. So you want to create a way to evaluate them and allow them to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that's most appropriate for how they learn and how they can demonstrate that knowledge. In some instances, we can provide modified grading. So this is what you want to say. What modified grading is essentially showing a fair representation of the way the student has performed. And so for some students, like saying, Michael, you got a 78 on this paper, it might not mean much to him. And so you could come up with a new sort of grading system or even representation of grades. It might be, I don't know. I mean, saying the smiley face thing sounds silly, but you could come up with some sort of sticker system or whatever it is, and then what that translates to. So you could essentially create a new scale for your student, but then if you need to be using true scores for your own purposes, you know how to translate the student score to raw scores or convert them rather. So that is another option for accommodations. And then I kind of hit on this a little bit previously, but some of the legalities of individualized grading for students with IEPs, you can have individualized grading for students with disabilities if they have modifications that are noted in the IEP. But you should not use individualized grading or a different type of grading system for students who do not have IEPs unless you make it across the board. So let's say, for example, you provide, you give extra credit, right, for everyone across the board, then that's fine. But you don't necessarily give 5 points extra credit to Tommy because Tommy has a disability. Like that, it doesn't work like that. It has to be a specific strategy, right? So for example, if a student does fewer problems on a worksheet, they can still get a 100 on that worksheet. They don't get a 50 because they only did half the problems, right? They still get full credit. So it's sort of like thinking about how you weigh the work that your students are doing. I think the individualized grading is fairly uncommon. I haven't seen many teachers using it in the field too much, but it is an option if it's something that needs to be done. So it's something we have to be careful with and really think through why we're using individualized grading and how. So take a moment here to think about some other accommodations that you might find on IEPs. If any of you are in current placements, or I know there's several of you who are already in the classroom as teachers, what are some of the accommodations you have seen on your IEPs or on your students' IEPs? And how have you sort of supported them in implementing those accommodations effectively? And then think about what some of those challenges might have been, okay? Reflect on that, and then let's think about how to design evaluations that are fair to all of your students. So one of the ways to do this is by having a number and variety of questions and test formats. So this is kind of that going back to the universal design that we talked about at some point in the semester. If you have a variety of questions and different formats, this is making your test accessible to all of your learners, right? And you want to think about ways to demonstrate your ability to create performance-based assessments. So using rubrics for projects, having portfolios where students can even engage in self-evaluation. Those are ways to look at fair evaluation of student knowledge, student content knowledge, and ability to apply their knowledge in practice. So by developing a portfolio, for example. So you want to be sure that your evaluations are fair. Um, if you have other questions about how to evaluate student learning, we can talk more about that. There may be an IRIS module related to evaluation. I will go back and look and add that in to the presentation for this week. I didn't add that in beforehand, so I do apologize. I'm pretty sure there is one on evaluation that's pretty good. So I'll go back to the actual presentation that you have access to and add that in. It won't be here in the audio lecture, obviously, but I will try to add that into the slides for you. So as a quick wrap up for this week, please read chapter 11 in your textbook, and then your weekly reflection is due by next Sunday at 11:55. Coming up, we have our final traditional sort of lecture will be responding to student behavior. And just as a quick note, that one is your reflection for that week is due on Wednesday, November 28th. I realize that next week is Thanksgiving, so I'm going to give you a couple extra days to get your reflections submitted. So your reflections are due on Wednesday, November 28th. And then that is the same week as your immersion week. So November 26th, 27th, and 28th are our immersion days. Please sign up. Click the link here if you have not yet done so. I think there are about half of you who still need to sign up for your immersion week. And I will be sure to give you more detailed information about how to prepare for that week in advance. And then finally, your inclusive teaching guide is due on December 12th. And your presentations for that are on December 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And similarly, there are about half of you who still need to sign up for those dates. Please do so as soon as possible. And please contact me if for some reason you are not able to make any of those dates. I hope that everyone is able to do so, but I can try to make other arrangements if there is a urgent need for those of you who cannot. So again, please sign up at the link here if you have not yet signed up for your presentation. And I think that's everything for this week. We're getting really close. So we just have obviously this lecture, then the following lecture on responding to student behavior. We have immersion week and then our final week. So you're getting very close. I hope that you all are learning strategies and learning content and feeling more confident about supporting students with disabilities. I can see how much many of you have grown already in this course just from your reflections, the way you talk about disability, the way you talk about students with disabilities, the way you are engaging in conversations with your peers through the immersion experiences, etc. So I appreciate how dedicated you are and how hard you are working in this course. And you're doing a great job. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. And I look forward to, quick reminder here. I know I'm going quite slowly with your disability investigations, but I will try to finish grading those this week. It just takes a while. So typically in a face-to-face classroom, you would present these in class, right? And so I'm having to watch them individually 10 to 15 minutes and grade them. So it's just taken me a bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope to get those back to you within the next week or so. So please forgive me for the delay on that. All right. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you.